They showed up out of nowhere, three strangers in black marching straight onto my dock like they owned the place. My fishing line hung idle as my heart raced, and I could feel my hands trembling between anger and disbelief. They flashed what looked like badges, demanding I stop, claiming I had no right to be on my own property. Standing on the edge of my lake, the same spot I've fished since childhood, I couldn't believe what was happening. My HOA president just stood there smirking, as if this was all part of some twisted joke. Could this really be happening in my own backyard? Or had my quiet life just turned into a nightmare? My mornings usually began the same way, the gentle mist rising off the lake, the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze, and the familiar weight of my fishing rod in my hand. For as long as I could remember, this lake had been my sanctuary, a quiet escape from the endless rhythm of work, emails, and city noise. The water shimmered in the morning sun, reflecting the tall pines that lined the shore, and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface was like a private applause just for me. My neighbors waved as they jogged along the paths, kids laughed in their yards, and life felt simple, contained, predictable. I had moved into this neighborhood years ago, drawn by the sense of community and the promise of wide open spaces where my family could breathe, play, and relax. My house wasn't the grandest on the street. Still, it had character, a little dock that jutted into the lake, a cozy porch perfect for coffee at sunrise, and a backyard where my dog could roam freely without a leash. On weekends, I'd invite friends over for a small barbecue, or sometimes I'd sit alone on the dock, line in hand, thinking about everything and nothing all at once. It was a neighborhood that prided itself on rules, well-kept lawns, and a certain appearance of harmony. The HOA newsletters often reminded us about quiet hours, lawn standards, and parking regulations. Most of the time, they were background noise, nothing that interfered with daily life. But in hindsight, the little mentions of lake access regulations and dock usage guidelines should have been warning signs. I first noticed her, the HOA president, during one of those sunny afternoons. She was always impeccably dressed, clipboard in hand, walking the neighborhood with the air of someone inspecting not just houses, but lives. At first, her presence seemed harmless, almost charming. She greeted neighbors, asked about their kids, and made notes about the landscaping. But there was an edge to her smile, something in the way she lingered on the docks or peeked over fences, that made the air feel heavier. My family and I tried to ignore it. We continued our routines, weekends fishing, kids laughing along the shoreline, quiet evenings on the porch. Life seemed normal, almost idyllic. Yet beneath that surface, the tension was starting to bubble. Minor incidents began to crop up, a terse letter about the height of my dock, a warning about unpermitted steps I had built years ago, subtle hints that my enjoyment of the lake was being watched, judged, and possibly challenged. I brushed it off, thinking maybe the HOA was doing its job, or perhaps it was nothing personal. After all, who would target someone for fishing on their own property? But deep down, a knot of unease began to form. Every time I heard the faint crunch of tires on gravel or spotted a figure lingering near the shore, a slight shiver ran down my spine. It was as if the tranquility I had taken for granted was slowly eroding, replaced by a quiet tension that hinted at conflict. Something bigger than petty rules or neighborhood squabbles. And so life continued, normal on the surface, but with an undercurrent I couldn't ignore. Little did I know, the serene mornings and peaceful afternoons were about to be shattered by a dispute that would test not just my patience, but my rights, my property, and my sense of safety. The storm was coming, and it would arrive in a way I never could have imagined, with no warning, no chance to prepare, and no easy way to walk away. The first letter came quietly, almost like a whisper, tucked into my mailbox among the usual pile of bills and advertisements. I barely glanced at it at first. Just another routine notice from the HOA, I thought. But the words jumped off the page. Dock in violation of HOA lake use regulations. Immediate compliance is required or fines will be imposed. I reread it, my mind racing. My dock had been there for over a decade. The same one my family had used every summer, every quiet morning, every evening watching the sun dip behind the pines. No changes, no complaints, just me, my fishing rod, and the lake. How could it suddenly be in violation? I called the HOA office to ask for clarification, thinking perhaps it was a mistake. That's when I first heard her voice, the HOA president. Smooth, calm, but with a subtle edge that made every word feel like a trap. "Mr. Homeowner, the rules are clear," she said. "Any dock construction or maintenance requires prior approval, and yours hasn't been updated in years. Fines will begin immediately if not resolved." My head spun. I had photos, permits from years ago, and neighbors who could attest to my dock's existence. But none of that seemed to matter. Then came the first visit. Not a friendly knock on the door, not a polite inquiry. 3 men showed up, dressed in dark uniforms, unfamiliar faces, standing stiff and silent as they stared at my dock. "You need to stop using this immediately," one of them said flatly. The tone was chilling, the certainty in their posture like they were trained to intimidate. My heart pounded. I asked for identification, reasoning that perhaps there was some misunderstanding. They didn't give any, only staring with an unsettling calm. I reached for my phone, ready to call for help. Still, before I could, the HOA president appeared at the edge of my lawn, clipboard in hand, smiling as if this was some absurd performance meant solely to embarrass me. "We just want to ensure compliance," she said sweetly, while her thugs lingered, silent and imposing. I tried to reason, to explain that this was my private property, that I had a right to be on my own dock. Still, every word seemed to bounce off an invisible wall of authority she had constructed around herself. Over the next few weeks, the harassment intensified. Letters turned into fines. Fines turned into more letters. Every small action I took, fixing a loose plank, trimming the dock's edges, leaving a chair out by the water, was met with another notice. The HOA seemed to have a microscope on me, tracking every detail, inventing violations, and stretching rules to absurd lengths. The calm mornings I once cherished were replaced with a sense of dread. Every time I approached the lake, I half expected to find someone waiting to tell me I was in the wrong. Neighbors began to notice. Some whispered behind fences, eyes wide, unsure if they should intervene. Others kept their distance, fearful of drawing attention themselves. A sense of isolation settled over me. I wasn't just fighting for a dock. I was fighting for the right to enjoy the very property I had inherited, the land my family had loved for generations. And yet, the HOA's reach seemed limitless, the president untouchable, wielding bureaucracy like a weapon. The first real escalation came when the fines doubled overnight. It wasn't a warning this time, it was a statement. They wanted to make me comply, and money was the lever they chose. I spent hours poring over HOA documents, city ordinances, and any other relevant information that could give me a foothold. The deeper I dug, the more absurd it became. Vague clauses about lake aesthetic compliance, rules that contradicted themselves. These policies were selectively enforced based on the last complainant. Every page seemed designed to trap, confuse, and intimidate. And then came the personal threats, subtle at first. Notes slipped under my door, suggesting that further non-compliance could lead to action from authorities. I laughed nervously, thinking it was a scare tactic. But my laughter faded when I realized they weren't bluffing. Vehicles I didn't recognize began appearing in my driveway, always parked just long enough to be noticed. Shadows moved near my dock at night. The world I had considered safe was slipping away, replaced by a constant tension. The knowledge that the HOA president and her enforcers were willing to cross every line to assert power. One afternoon, I caught them red-handed, 2 men taking measurements of my dock while I was at work. I didn't confront them directly. I documented everything. Photos, timestamps, video clips. I knew I needed proof, something undeniable, because if this escalated further, no one would believe me otherwise. That's when the thought first struck me. This wasn't about rules. It was about control, about asserting dominance over someone who had lived here longer, who had done nothing wrong but exist on land they claimed to own. Weeks turned into a tense standoff. I tried mediating, sending emails, requesting meetings, and attempting every reasonable solution. Each attempt was met with condescension, delays, and more fines. The HOA president was meticulous, calculating, and entirely unapologetic. I began to see a pattern. Small harassment, escalating pressure, psychological warfare, all to provoke me into submission. And the more I resisted, the more inventive her tactics became. Then came the day that pushed me over the edge. A notice appeared in my mailbox, marked urgent. It wasn't just about the dock anymore. They claimed I had obstructed authorized personnel and threatened that law enforcement could be involved if I didn't comply immediately. My stomach dropped. The lines between HOA authority and actual legal enforcement were blurring. I realized that if I didn't act fast, I could face serious consequences for doing nothing more than enjoying my property. I started planning, researching, and talking to local authorities, legal advisors, and anyone else who could help me navigate this absurd escalation. Each meeting confirmed what I suspected. The HOA president had overstepped, and yet the process to hold her accountable was slow and bureaucratic. Every delay was intentional, every notice designed to wear me down emotionally and financially. My once peaceful life had transformed into a daily battle, and the lake, my sanctuary, had become a battleground. And just when I thought the situation couldn't get any worse, I received a call from a neighbor who had witnessed something that made my blood run cold. The HOA president had instructed her team to visit my dock later that week to ensure compliance in person. That's when I realized the harassment was no longer just administrative. It was personal. And it was about to become dangerous. The day arrived with heavy clouds hanging low, and the lake's reflection dimmed, almost mirroring the dread I felt in my chest. I watched from my porch as black SUVs crept down the driveway, the kind of vehicles that didn't belong in a quiet neighborhood. My stomach knotted as the figures stepped out. 3 men, tall, imposing, dressed in dark uniforms that seemed intentionally intimidating. My heart raced, and I couldn't decide whether to call the police immediately or wait, hoping I could de-escalate without confrontation. They approached my dock slowly, methodically like predators circling prey. I stepped outside, hands raised, trying to maintain calm. "I'm just here on my property," I said firmly. No response, only a lingering stare from the tallest man, whose presence alone seemed to project authority. It was surreal, absurd even. How could private citizens show up on someone's land dressed like enforcers and expect obedience? Yet the intimidation in their posture was undeniable. From the corner of my eye, I noticed the HOA president watching from the edge of the lawn, clipboard in hand, her smirk growing as if she were watching a game unfold. My blood boiled. I had endured letters, fines, and subtle threats, but this was beyond anything I had imagined. It wasn't about rules anymore. It was about dominance, about proving that I couldn't resist her authority. And I wasn't about to let that happen. I stepped closer to the dock, documenting everything with my phone. Photos, videos, timestamps, proof of the harassment, proof of trespassing. I reminded myself that staying calm was key. If they escalated, I had evidence. If I reacted, it could be used against me. And yet, the tension was unbearable. Each second felt stretched, each breath a countdown to confrontation. Hours passed as they lingered, taking measurements, inspecting the dock, asking questions in that flat, rehearsed tone that betrayed no emotion. I felt trapped, helpless, furious, but also determined. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about standing up to arbitrary power, about defending my rights, and about showing that intimidation would not work. Then came the first real verbal confrontation. The tallest man spoke, his voice low and steady. "You need to leave immediately, or we'll escalate this matter." I asked who authorized them, demanded identification. Silence. The HOA president wrote notes, her expression smug, as if the intimidation itself was victory enough. My hands shook, not from fear, but from rage. I retreated to the house briefly to call local wildlife enforcement. The legal advisor I had spoken to warned me, if these men were impersonating authorities, it could be criminal. If they were acting under the HOA, their actions might still cross the line. Every moment mattered. I explained the situation, sending videos and photos in real time, making it clear that trespassing and harassment were occurring. By the time I returned to the dock, they had finished their inspection, or so it seemed. I knew the next hours could define the battle. Each step I took was measured, each word deliberate. I had one chance to document, to assert my rights, to ensure that the harassment would have consequences. My patience and preparation were the only shields I had against escalation. Then, in a surreal twist, one of the men stepped closer, gesturing toward the water. "You cannot fish here," he said. "You will face consequences if you continue." My jaw tightened. I realized I had reached the peak of absurdity. Being told I couldn't fish on my own dock, on my own property, by strangers with no legal authority, I remained calm, raised my phone to record, and took a deep breath. This confrontation, this moment of tension, wasn't just about the dock. It was about principle, justice, and standing firm against an overreaching authority. Every second counted, every reaction mattered. And as the black SUVs waited silently and the HOA president's smirk lingered, I knew that the next move could change everything. The rising action didn't end there. The situation escalated further over the following days. More letters, more fines, and whispers of legal threats. Each interaction pushed me closer to the edge, testing patience, endurance, and resolve. Yet I was no longer just reacting. I was strategizing, building a case, and preparing for the moment when the imbalance of power would finally tilt in my favor. Cliffhangers loomed at every turn. Would the HOA push further and risk breaking the law? Could I protect my property without provoking real danger? And as I stood on my dock late one evening, watching shadows move across the water, I knew that the climax, the moment when everything would come to a head, was approaching faster than I could imagine. The stage was set, the tension unbearable, and the conflict escalating. Every letter, every visit, every threat had led to this point. A collision between petty power and rightful ownership, between intimidation and justice. And the lake, my sanctuary for decades, had become the battleground where the actual story would finally unfold. The tension had been building for weeks, each day heavier than the last, until it finally reached a point where it was impossible to ignore. I stood on my dock one early morning, the lake still and glassy, the sun just beginning to peek over the horizon. Birds called softly in the distance, oblivious to the storm that was about to erupt. My hands gripped the railing, knuckles white. As I thought back over every unfair letter, every fine, every intrusive visit, every humiliating encounter orchestrated by the HOA president and her so-called enforcers. This wasn't just a conflict anymore. It was a full-scale assault on my rights, my property, and my sanity. Earlier that week, I had spoken with wildlife enforcement officers, providing them with documentation, video footage, and sworn statements from neighbors who had witnessed the ongoing harassment. They had assured me that if any unauthorized individuals attempted to assert authority on my property, they would respond immediately. I knew that today might be the day when that preparation paid off, but nothing could calm the nervous knot in my stomach. I wasn't alone on the dock when it happened. The first black SUV rolled slowly down the gravel drive, followed by the second and then a third. My heart skipped a beat as 3 men stepped out, the same intimidating presence I had encountered before. Their uniforms were crisp, their postures rigid. I could see the glint of their badges, or what I assumed were badges, from the corner of my eye, the same threatening display intended to assert control. But I was ready this time. The HOA president followed, clipboard in hand, her expression smug, almost theatrical. She had that same smirk I had come to hate, the one that implied victory before the battle even began. She strode confidently toward the dock, speaking in that clipped, patronizing tone. "Mr. Homeowner, you are in violation," she said. "Leave the dock immediately or face consequences." I raised my phone, keeping the camera trained on her and her enforcers. "You have no authority here," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through me. "This is my private property. I've documented everything. Wildlife enforcement has been notified." "Step back!" For a moment there was stunned silence. The men exchanged glances, unease flickering across their faces for the first time. The HOA president's smirk faltered, just slightly, but only enough to notice if you were paying attention. She realized, perhaps too late, that her usual tactics of intimidation and bureaucratic manipulation might not work this time. Then, The crackle of a radio broke the tension. Wildlife enforcement officers were on site, their vehicles rumbling down the driveway, lights flashing. Not a threatening display, but a professional, measured arrival that shifted the balance entirely. I could feel my chest lift, the weight of weeks of stress beginning to ease just slightly, though the adrenaline still coursed through every fiber of my body. The confrontation began in earnest. The HOA president tried to assert authority verbally, insisting that fines and notices were legally binding, attempting to intimidate the men from law enforcement who calmly approached the dock. She gestured wildly, her clipboard swinging as if it were a sword, demanding that they leave, claiming some imaginary jurisdiction over my property. The officers, calm and precise, explained that any further harassment or trespassing would be considered illegal and actionable immediately. I stood silently, documenting every word, every gesture, every reaction. The intensity of the moment was palpable. I could feel the power struggle unfolding like a storm over the lake. The HOA president's smirk had entirely vanished now, replaced by a sharp edge of panic. She realized that her empire of intimidation had limits, and those limits were being enforced before my eyes. Then one of her enforcers stepped forward, attempting to assert control over the situation, pointing at my dock, trying to insist that I comply. The wildlife officers moved between us calmly but firmly, establishing a clear boundary. "Sir, you are on private property without authorization. You must leave," one officer said. The man froze, realizing for the first time that the illusion of HOA authority no longer shielded his actions. The tension escalated further as the HOA president demanded that the men stand down, shouting over the calm voices of the officers. Her argument was precise, rehearsed, but hollow. The reality of law enforcement presence rendered her bureaucratic threats meaningless. I could feel the justice of the moment in every detail. The lake's surface reflecting the rising sun, the birds' calls in the background, the sense of vindication building in my chest. Then, it happened. One of the officers motioned toward her enforcers. "You are under investigation for trespassing and impersonating authority," he said. The words hit like a thunderclap. The men's faces drained of color, their confidence evaporating instantly. The HOA president's voice faltered as she demanded proof, demanded explanations. But the evidence was irrefutable. Videos, photographs, timestamps, all laid out clearly, directly from the moments of harassment she had orchestrated. I could hardly believe it as the officers started taking statements, carefully documenting the entire scenario. I watched, stunned, as the very people who had tried to intimidate me, to assert false authority, were now being held accountable. The power dynamics had shifted completely, and I could see it in their eyes: confusion, fear, and the dawning realization that their schemes had failed spectacularly. The confrontation stretched for what felt like hours, though in reality it was likely closer to an hour. Each moment intensified the drama, officers questioning her actions, me providing calm but pointed commentary, her attempts to undermine authority being systematically dismantled. The tension was cinematic, almost unreal: the lake, the early morning light, the flutter of flags in the breeze, the stifled gasps of neighbors who had gathered at a safe distance, witnessing the unraveling of an empire built on fear and rules. The HOA president's frustration was palpable. She attempted one final desperate maneuver, demanding immediate compliance, threatening additional fines, and implying legal consequences for resisting. But the wildlife officers cut through it with a clear, unwavering statement. "Further harassment or trespassing will result in immediate legal action. You are no longer in a position to enforce these so-called rules." In that moment, a wave of triumph washed over me. Weeks of stress, sleepless nights, and constant intimidation had culminated in a decisive victory. The lake, my sanctuary, was safe once more, not because the HOA had changed, but because justice had been enforced. I felt an overwhelming sense of vindication, the emotional weight of the harassment lifting from my shoulders. Yet even as the officers escorted the trespassers off my property, a subtle tension remained. The HOA president stood frozen, her authority stripped away publicly, humiliated in front of neighbors who had quietly observed her machinations for years. The scene was surreal. Bureaucratic power, which had seemed untouchable, lay bare and powerless in the face of rightful enforcement. Neighbors emerged, cautiously at first, offering murmured congratulations, relief and disbelief. I could see the ripple effect of what had happened, whispers spreading, eyes opening to the abuse of power that had been hidden behind newsletters, fines, and subtle intimidation. It wasn't just my victory. It was a message to the community that boundaries exist for a reason and that manipulation and harassment would not go unchallenged. The lake glimmered, calm once more, reflecting the rising sun. I took a deep breath, feeling the culmination of tension, fear, and frustration finally resolve into clarity and triumph. Every unfair letter, every intrusive visit, every fine, every scare tactic had led to this moment. The HOA president's scheme dismantled, her authority publicly questioned, and my right to enjoy my property affirmed beyond doubt. Even in the midst of victory, however, a part of me remained vigilant. I knew that the road ahead wouldn't be completely free of conflict. People like her rarely give up quietly. But for now, the turning point had been reached. The emotional intensity of the confrontation, the stakes of personal property rights versus bureaucratic overreach, had reached their peak, and the story was far from over. The resolution, the aftermath, and the ripple effects of this confrontation would continue to unfold in ways that no one could yet predict. As I stood on the dock, the evidence safely documented, the officers preparing to leave, I allowed myself a rare moment of satisfaction. The fight had been brutal, the intimidation relentless. Still, justice had been served in a way that no letter, fine, or anonymous threat could undo. Yet, even as I exhaled, a thought lingered in my mind. Had this ordeal truly ended, or was it only the beginning of a new chapter in the ongoing struggle between ordinary homeowners and overreaching authority? The tension that had gripped my life for weeks finally began to ease. However, the echoes of the confrontation still reverberated through every corner of my property. The lake, once a battlefield, had returned to its peaceful state. The gentle ripples reflecting the early morning sunlight, the occasional fish breaking the surface in a quiet dance, and the distant calls of birds reclaiming the serenity I had almost lost. Standing on my dock, I allowed myself a slow, deliberate breath, savoring the calm after the storm. But this wasn't merely about serenity restored. It was about the validation of rights, the affirmation of justice, and the reclaiming of personal space that had been so aggressively challenged. The aftermath unfolded slowly, methodically, but each step reinforced the impact of the confrontation. The HOA president and her enforcers faced formal investigations for trespassing and for attempting to impersonate authority. I received official letters confirming that any further harassment would be met with immediate legal action, effectively stripping them of the power they had wielded so brazenly. For the first time, I felt the actual weight of the law supporting me, a shield I had painstakingly assembled with documentation, photos, and video evidence. Every fine that had been issued, every unjust claim, and every subtle threat was rendered null and void. The sense of vindication was profound, not because I had defeated a bureaucratic foe, but because I had protected what was rightfully mine. Neighbors, who had quietly observed the unfolding drama, began to reach out. Their whispers of disbelief transformed into conversations and ultimately into solidarity. Many admitted that they had long suspected overreach by the HOA, but no one had dared confront it. My situation became a catalyst, revealing patterns of intimidation that had persisted under a veneer of civility and regulation. The ripple effects were immediate. Other residents began documenting interactions, challenging questionable fines, and demanding transparency. In this sense, my confrontation was no longer just a personal victory. It was a small but powerful shift in the community, a precedent demonstrating that overreach could be met with resistance and that individual rights mattered, even against an entrenched authority. The lake, which had once been the site of intimidation and fear, returned to its role as a sanctuary. Mornings resumed with the quiet rhythm I had cherished for so long. The weight of dread that had accompanied every approach to the dock was lifted, replaced by a cautious optimism. I fished again, my line gliding through the water without the anxiety of looming threats. My family's laughter returned to the shoreline, blending with the natural sounds of the lake. The very act of enjoying the property, a privilege that had once been threatened, became a reaffirmation of resilience. Yet the resolution was not just about reclaiming space. It was about the long-term consequences for the HOA president and the culture she had fostered. Her authority, once unchallenged, had been publicly undermined. Members of the community who had previously deferred to her judgment began questioning policies and scrutinizing notices more carefully. The veneer of control she had relied upon cracked, revealing both her limitations and the fragility of power built on fear. Internal discussions within the HOA shifted from procedural enforcement to accountability, transparency, and legality. While change was slow, the seeds of reform had been sown, all catalyzed by the decisive stand I had taken. Personally, the ordeal reshaped my approach to community life. I learned the importance of preparation, documentation, and calm assertiveness when confronting unjust authority. The weeks of tension, sleepless nights, and strategic planning were exhausting. Still, they reinforced a critical lesson. When faced with intimidation, measured action, backed by evidence and law, can overcome even the most aggressive overreach. I also realized the value of community. Even when others remain silent, their presence, witness, and eventual support can transform a private battle into a public affirmation of rights. There were emotional consequences, too. For a time, the stress had been overwhelming, hands trembling at the thought of encounters, sleep interrupted by imagined confrontations, a pervasive sense of violation and helplessness. That psychological weight lifted gradually, replaced by a sense of empowerment and clarity. I was no longer reacting defensively, but living proactively, aware of my rights and capable of defending them. That transformation, subtle yet profound, underscored that resolution is not merely about ending a conflict, but reclaiming agency and restoring inner peace. As the weeks turned into months, I noticed a shift in the neighborhood dynamic. Conversations became more candid, disputes more transparent, and challenges to authority more thoughtful. The HOA's previously unquestioned power was now tempered by scrutiny, and a culture of intimidation gave way slowly to one of accountability. Residents began documenting changes, confirming compliance through mutual understanding rather than fear, and collectively ensuring that rules served the community rather than individuals exploiting them. It was a quiet revolution, one sparked by a single determined stand. The personal stakes, however, remained tangible. Each time I walked along the dock, I was reminded not only of the confrontation but of the resilience required to face it. The lake, the dock, the surrounding land, all elements of my life that had been threatened, now symbolized perseverance and justice. The physical reclamation of space mirrored the emotional reclamation of peace and confidence. I understood that the lessons learned extended beyond property disputes. They applied to any situation where authority is abused and rights are undermined. The most powerful takeaway emerged in the interactions with my neighbors. One afternoon, an elderly resident approached me on the dock, eyes wide with awe and relief. "I thought you were finished for sure," she admitted, voice trembling. I never imagined standing up to her was possible. I smiled, realizing that my experience had inspired others, not through confrontation alone, but through the demonstration that lawful, composed action could succeed. The emotional impact rippled outward, validating courage and reinforcing the principle that standing up for what is right often empowers those who have felt powerless. A tangible shift in HOA behavior accompanied the legal affirmation and community support. Notices became precise. Fines were scrutinized before issuance, and any future actions were tempered by awareness of enforcement oversight. The president's attempts at intimidation were curtailed, replaced by a cautious professionalism she had not previously exhibited. While no system is perfect, the balance had been restored. Authority no longer operated unchecked, and residents had a framework to challenge overreach without fear of reprisal. Even more profoundly, the confrontation instilled a lasting sense of confidence in my own ability to navigate conflict. I no longer approached property disputes, community disagreements, or bureaucratic challenges with fear. The lessons of patience, documentation, strategic planning, and leveraging legal protections became tools for future challenges. The experience, while harrowing, strengthened resilience, transforming vulnerability into empowerment and chaos into clarity. Over time, the lake returned to its role as a symbol rather than a battleground. The gentle ripple of water against the dock, the quiet rustle of leaves in the breeze, and the laughter of children playing near the shoreline reclaimed their rightful place. Fishing again became a ritual of peace, not tension, and the emotional scars of confrontation slowly faded into memories that reminded me of the lessons learned rather than the fear endured. The broader impact of the ordeal extended beyond my property. It became a cautionary tale within the community, a demonstration that overreach has limits, that intimidation can be challenged, and that vigilance is necessary to maintain fairness. Residents began sharing experiences, documenting interactions, and collectively asserting their rights. A culture of accountability gradually replaced one of fear, and the HOA itself underwent scrutiny that had previously been absent. Change, subtle but real, had begun. Reflecting on the journey, I realized the story wasn't merely about a dock, a lake, or a confrontation with an overbearing HOA president. It was about asserting agency, defending rights, and maintaining dignity in the face of relentless pressure. It was about understanding that the balance between authority and personal freedom is delicate, requiring both vigilance and courage to uphold. And it was about recognizing that even when systems fail or individuals abuse power, preparation, resolve, and lawful action can restore justice. The experience left me with a renewed perspective on community, authority, and personal responsibility. I approached each day with a quiet confidence, aware of my rights and the limits of power. I engaged with neighbors more openly, sharing knowledge and guidance to prevent future overreach. I remained vigilant, not paranoid, recognizing that the lessons learned would serve as a lifelong toolkit for navigating challenges, conflicts, and disputes. And yet, as the final letters were filed, the fines were nullified. The trespassing issue was formally resolved, but a subtle yet profound question lingered. How many other residents had silently endured similar harassment, lacking the courage, resources, or legal support to challenge it? My victory was complete for me, but it illuminated the broader need for awareness, preparedness, and community solidarity. The resolution was not only personal but symbolic, a reminder that standing up for what is right can inspire change far beyond the immediate conflict. As I stood on the dock one last time, watching the sun rise entirely above the tree line, I let the weight of the ordeal settle behind me. The lake shimmered peacefully, the air was calm, and the world felt restored. The battle had been fought, justice had been upheld, and a precedent had been set, not just for me, but for anyone who might face intimidation, overreach, or bureaucratic abuse in the future. The confrontation had ended, but its impact would ripple through the community for years to come. In the end, the lesson was clear. Power, no matter how entrenched, is not absolute. Rights, no matter how challenged, are defendable, and perseverance tempered with preparation and resolve can turn even the most harrowing conflict into a triumph. The lake had been reclaimed, my sanctuary restored, and with it, a deeper understanding of courage, justice, and the enduring importance of standing firm, even when the odds seem insurmountable. And as the gentle waves lapped against the dock, I realized that the story, while concluded in confrontation, had only just begun in its lessons, a reminder to every homeowner, neighbor, and community member that vigilance, preparation, and courage are the actual anchors in any storm of injustice.